This live I think will be slightly different to how I usually do my lives on a Tuesday afternoon. Oh, there's some other people. Hi Sue, hi Catherine. Lovely to have you here. Normally, if you're used to watching our design team Facebook lives, we have the sort of advert within the group to let you know the time and what we'll be doing, and there's a finished project. I thought I'd do something a little bit different this time to introduce you to Lisa's stencils. Watching back over the last few lives and some of Lisa's lives and just looking at feedback, there are quite a few people who are new to stencils, they're new to the group. Oh, hi Natasha. Obviously there's always going to be people new to crafting in general. So what I thought I'd do, I'd perhaps have a little chat over the next half an hour or so-ish to introduce you to stencils and some ink blending techniques as well. Now if this goes well and I get sort of good feedback from today, I may do this over the next couple of weeks, because trying to cram everything into sort of a half an hour or so live is probably just too much, and I don't want to bamboozle anybody, and I just want to give you enough information so you have the confidence to go and try, and then once you've got that figured and practiced for the week, then you can come back for more and I can give you a little bit extra. So hopefully that will work for people. You would have seen the header for this Facebook Live, and you would have seen these projects. These are just things that I've sort of put together over the past couple of days just to give you some ideas of what you can do with stencils, and just show you how I created them and just how quick you can create backgrounds like this using stencils and inks. Okay, so we've got a few different finishes here. I've got this other one here as well, which is also, this has got a 3D finish to it as well. Now I'll admit sort of straight away, I'm not great at using sort of 3D paste to create a 3D finish with masks and stencils. The best people for that, or the people who sort of really excel at that in the design team group, are Heidi and Natasha. And I'm sure that there'll be other lives where they'll show you how to do that as well, but I will touch on that just to give you a complete overview. But you'll see here as I pick these up, all of these just are like one single pieces of cardstock with layered stencils on here to create a really lovely background. And this has got a little bit of heat embossing as well, which I will touch on that also. So let me just introduce stencils to you briefly. Most of you are probably aware that there are stencils in the craft market. Lisa's are particularly great because she makes them from a really lovely mylar, which is like the plastic, the material. This is it's 350 micron, which for those of you who that means nothing to, it's basically a really thick plasticky material which holds its shape really well, even on something as delicate as a pattern like this. Hopefully you can see that against the white there. You say, I mean, this will look really delicate, but this really holds its own when you're using blending sponges and blending brushes. You can see how well the mylar holds its structure when you've got a stencil a bit more substantial like this, where you have a lot of plastic still. It's really sturdy and it won't bend or buckle under your blending tools. Now I would sort of group these stencils into sort of 3 different groups, I would say. I'll just go through them briefly. Let me just see. I've organised them for my different demos here. So you have the stencils like this, which I would say are your... Let me just get a darker piece of paper. There we go. Let me hold this against the black. This would look better. So you have really fine stencils like this, which are really intricate. They give you an awful lot of detail. and I would use these to layer. There's an awful lot of these types of stencils and they give you really intricate detail, and this is what I would use from the first layers of ink that I would put down, and I would layer these together, different patterns on top with different coloured inks. Then once I'd built up my background using something really fine like this, I would then bring in stencils that look a bit like this, and I would say this is what adds detail, because there's less, how would you say it, less patterning on the stencil, as you say, and this would add the fine detail that you would put in a really darker ink that would sit on top of your layered patterns, a bit like the way you would use really intricate stamps. Then there is a third type of stencil, and say this is just how I classify the stencils and how I work and sort of structure my projects. I mean, this isn't sort of a standard terminology, but then you get a stencil like this where we're basically looking at an aperture. So we have a very large open space within the stencil itself where you can create a lot of work within that. I would call these the aperture stencils, and these lend themselves to an awful lot more work actually within the aperture here, and I shall try and go into that also this time. So let me get into the demos, because there's nothing better than actually seeing these things in progress. So if you just bear with me a second, I'll just put my demo pieces back together. Okie dokie. Right, I'll apologise in advance. You may hear the puppy in the background. If I shut she can't come into the room, but if I shut the door, then I can guarantee that she'll squeak and shout at me and make even more fuss. But she may have the odd woof in the background there, if you can hear her. Generally, she's pretty good, so she should be okay. Right, let me make sure everything is in the right place. Okay, so let me just start off with the structure paste. So with stencils, obviously you can use ink through them, you can use any sort of 3D media. So you have structure paste, you have mousses from various manufacturers and whatever, and these actually create a 3D raised image on your card with whichever colour you want to use. Now this one I've used the stars, so I'll just show you quickly. I would use Lisa's sunflower or daisy stencil for this one, and this is something that I know that Heidi excels at. She loves using her mixed media and creating projects, 3D projects with stencils like this. But I have a media here. This is like a paste, and all we do is like a trowel. We use like a trowel, and we just take a certain amount of that medium, and all we do, we smooth this medium through the stencil, spreading it like butter through the aperture of the stencil, and this gives us a lovely 3D effect. Now I think partly why I don't tend to do this very often is because you actually have to be really patient and allow this medium to dry, and I'm not actually very good at that, to be totally honest with you. I will put it to one side and I will let it dry, but then quite often as I get engrossed in the other stuff that I'm making while I'm waiting for this to dry, I tend to pile projects on top of this, and then I just ruin the image basically. So I've come to the conclusion that I'm not actually patient enough to use this type of stencil, but it creates a really lovely effect. So it's definitely worth trying if you have like 3D mediums and pastes at home in your craft store. Now what I will say though is, once that you've actually spread the paste like so, always put your stencil straight into a little water bath and clean up your materials, because the pastes generally, when they dry, they go rock solid and you don't want to ruin your stencil. But you can see there we have a gorgeous sunflower pattern, and when you use the right colour, like this yellow here, which does have actually a little bit of sparkle on that, that gives a really lovely effect, and that sunflower really pops through. So I wanted to do that one first because I need to put that one out of the way to dry now. Okay, so that's one way of using the stencils. The next way is the way that I really enjoy myself, and this is where we bring in the blending of the inks, and I can introduce you to how to get the best out of your inks and your colours and your blending, as well as producing lovely pieces of backing card, I suppose. So this stencil here, I've used the heart stencil, and I've used the text stencil in the background. Let's put those there so you can see. So you can see the way that I've worked here. We've used the heart stencil in the background with two different colours, and I've just accentuated that with a darker colour with this text sitting on top, and you can start seeing how these patterns start layering. I'm going to use slightly different stencils for this because I just want to show you all the different types of stencils that Lisa has in her store, and also try and incorporate what you may have in your craft stash also, because I appreciate you won't have these stencils, but honestly all these techniques that I'm showing you today really can be applied to anything you've got. So hopefully you may see something that you would recognise in your craft room, and you think, oh, I know what I can use to give that a go. So that's why I want to use slightly different stencils for the demos. I hope that makes sense. Okay, if you bear with me, I've got little bits and pieces all over the place, so I'm trying to keep myself organised. Now, whenever I do stenciling like this, I always work either onto something like Lisa's Messy Mat, which you see in the background here, because that gives a lovely smooth surface, which can also be cleaned really easily also. But I always have a piece of copy paper next to me. That's for two reasons. Initially, it allows me to test my colour blends first. So before you go into blending your inks, choose yourself some colours that you like, because it's always important to work with colours that you like, because that will just give you the enthusiasm to work then, and obviously two colours that work together. In later demos I'll show you how that you can actually use tones within one colour also, which works really well. But you'll notice when you watch Lisa's shows on Create and Craft and on her live demos also, she will always go for a pink, a yellow and a blue. Now sometimes she swaps the blue out for a green, or the pink for a red, but it's generally those sort of colours with sort of around the primary sort of colours, because once you blend them you start getting the mixes into the greens and to the oranges, and that gives you a really lovely effect without too much effort really. So today I'm using Distress ink. Now these are the regular inks. They just sit really nicely on top of each other, and they blend so well, and I'm using a pink and a yellow, so obviously when they start blending and merging you will get that orange colour. Now to start with, you'll see here I've got like a wood grain effect in the background. So to do that I'm taking the Hickory Smoke, which is a lovely grey colour, in the regular Distress ink. All I'm doing is really lightly, I'm pulling that ink down my piece of cardstock. Now the cardstock I'm using is Lisa's Super Smooth cardstock. Which, oh, what's the weight? I think it's about 280 GSM, so it's a sturdy weight. But any cardstock that you may have with a lovely smooth, like a silky surface, would be perfect to blend onto. So just to create this effect in the background, I'm just really lightly pulling that ink pad down the page, and it's so light that, I mean, you can see it resting there, and I'm just really sort of the fingertips just pulling that down, and you can see that's given me the effect. Now I'll just turn that round so I can just get that, this corner covered also. Right, I don't want to put this over the whole page. That is more than enough because I don't want it to dominate the pattern. Okay, so now I'm going to come in with my inks. Now I'm using this flower stencil instead of the heart in the background, so this should work really well. There's lots of open areas, so we'll get lots of areas to blend. I have my copy paper. The next thing we need to think about is what it is we're going to be using to blend with. Now, you may be aware that Lisa has her own blending brushes. These are pretty new, and unfortunately they are out of stock at the moment, but they are due in at some stage. So if you are interested in these, it might be worth just heading on the website, and you may be able to get an email notification to say when they're in stock. If not, then as soon as they're in stock, then the design team and Lisa will be shouting about it, and you'll know that they're available. But these really are some of the best brushes. Actually, they are the best brushes that I've used because of the density of the bristles. You can see as I'm moving my fingers across there that these fibres are packed so dense, and that is key to helping you blend really well. Now, if you don't have the brushes and you just have blending sponges, I will, oh, do I have clean ones? Yes, I do. I will use the blending tools for you. Now, this looks a little bit different to what you may have because I've made these myself, but they work the same way. If you have the regular blending tools with the detachable blending sponges, this is exactly what they are, just mine's a slightly different shape. But you have the blending sponges that's with the Velcro that sit on the end there. Now, a lot of people struggle with these initially, and it does take a little bit of practice, so hopefully I can address some of the issues that I think you may be having and hopefully help you get over that. This is why we need a piece of copy paper beside us. So we'll open up our ink pad. Now, to load up the sponge, don't be shy about the amount of ink that you put on. So really take your sponge and just rub it over the surface of your ink pad. And you can do this with whichever ink you're using actually. Now, the temptation would be to go straight from the ink pad straight onto your project. And I can guarantee what will happen, you will get that circle. And it's that circle that people then really struggle to blend out, because I'm going onto the copy paper, and the more I blend, you can see that that circle is just staying there. And I've done it myself, and I think, oh, I didn't blot off to one side, and I've been really annoyed with myself. And that can ruin your project, and it can sort of dishearten you a little bit. Let's say if you just go straight from the ink pad to your copy paper, you will get that initial really big blend. Now, the reason why we have the copy paper on the side is because you want that blob, as I would call it, to happen on your copy paper and not on your project. So I want to start off with pink on here, so I'm going to take my ink and I'm going to blot off the majority of that ink onto my copy paper, so now I can go onto my project and I won't have that initial blob of colour. Can you see the difference there? So if I go straight onto there, I get rid of that circle, which I don't want, and I can go gently onto my project over the stencil, and I get that really lovely airbrushed look. Now, the other way of doing this is also to go straight onto your blending mat. So we can load up our ink again, and we can blot that ink off on our blending mat. You don't need to push really hard, just really light, but what that does, it just softens the ink on the sponge there, and it allows you to move onto your project, and again you get that really soft airbrushed look. Now what I always suggest, when you're working off copy paper or the blending mat, start off your circles and your blending on your on a surface that isn't your project. So you see there, I'm actually spinning and going round and round in the blending motion, and then I'm working my way onto the project. So I start off the project and I work my way on, and it's that way that I can always be sure that I won't end up with that concentration of ink in one place that I can't blend out. Now I'm just going to turn my project around because I've done this side, and to save being awkward and trying to work from this side, it's always easier just to turn your project around. When you're working on smaller projects like this, it makes it easy. Now you'll see here I've just moved that stencil because this is a repeating pattern stencil, and I know that I can just replace that in place. So I shall show you again. So we load the ink up and we work off circular motions off project, and we gradually work our way on to the project like so, and we have a lovely airbrushed look. You can do exactly the same with the blending brush, and I'll just show you quickly for those of you who do have this. You work off the project and work onto the project. Now I'll just show you on this copy paper actually, but that these brushes are way more forgiving than the blending sponges, because to go straight, let's turn this over, to go straight onto and blend, you'll see all straight away we get that diffused airbrush look with these blending brushes, and I do it with a darker colour, and we don't get that concentration of ink, which is great. But I appreciate that not everybody has these brushes. So what I wanted to try and do is use the sponges, because I know that this is where people struggle. Now the other way that I hold my blending sponge, I don't lay it flat onto my work as I'm working. Certainly not at this stage. When I know that I've worked the majority of the ink off, then I do go flat and really work the sponge into all the intricate areas. But generally I work at an angle, and I won't give you it's not a precise angle, but it's just an angle so it isn't flat to the work. Let me see, it's really hard to show you. Let me turn this over, and if I do it this way, I'll just wait for the camera to pick up so I know that where I'm showing you. Let me see, here we are. Yeah, so generally I don't work so that the sponge is flat like that. I would always work at an angle, and you can see that on one side there is a little bit of a gap between the project or the card that I'm working onto and the sponge, and I always work with the sponge at an angle like that. That way you also get that gives you the sort of the graduation and that really lovely airbrushed look, and that's what allows you to blend. So let's line the stencil up again, and I should come in with a different colour. Now I'm coming in with a different colour. Now the orange is a slightly more, or a scattered straw, a slightly stronger colour than the pink, so I shall work that off onto the mat first and gradually work my way onto the project. Now I'm not pressing really hard either. That's another thing you don't have to do. You don't really have to work and really grind the sponge into the project either. Just work really sort of gently, fingertip. It is just fingertip pressure. That's all it is. Now I'm introducing this second colour onto the pink. I'm not going to put it everywhere, I'm just going to put it in sections. And this is something that you would have seen Lisa do, particularly on her 3 o'clock show yesterday, I think, where she used the lovely DL stencil with the flowers, and she used the yellow and the pink and the blue also. It's just do it in sections, and you can see here that if you do it light enough and just add different bits of colour, in different areas of the project. That's how you get your lovely blend. And just really gently, and you just work over the same area. And if you just do the gradual circular motions, sort of fingertip pressure, your inks and your colours will blend together. So as I pull that stencil away now, you can see how we've got that beginnings of a lovely background, which is very similar to the hearts that I used in the original sample, as you can see. So, all, you know, straight away now, all we've used is one stencil and 3 ink pads. You know, if you include the grey there in the background, and already we have a lovely background that you can stamp onto, you can die cut from, you can mount and give a nice little matte and layered border, and that give you a lovely background for the rest of your project, and you've set the colour scheme for it as well. Now, what I was saying about the extra details of the stencils, I'm going to come in with this text stencil now. I used the script one in the original sample, but I thought I'd come in with something slightly different, and this time I will use the hickory smoke, and I will use my blending sponge again. This would be, if you do have Lisa's brushes, this would be an ideal time to use one of these smaller brushes, because then you can use the detail work to actually get in and pick out the individual words of this stencil here. So I'm going to use my blending sponge. I'm going to blot off onto the page. Now don't be frightened of using a darker ink like this. I can blot this off, and what I'm making sure my word's actually the right way around. Yes, because that would be a little bit strange. I'm going to hold that in place, and I'm just gently, again, just fingertip pressure, I'm going to work that darker colour through the word stencils here, and this will give a lovely accent to the background that we've already created. So I hope people are sort of getting to grips with sort of the message I'm putting across here. Now, as I said before, I sort of, this is my own way sort of classing these stencils. This is like a detailed stencil, because there's an awful lot of plastic. Your sponge or even your brush actually blends really well over the plastic, and that will actually allow your sponge to give a really smooth application of ink through there. So you really don't need to press hard, because if actually that would be counterintuitive, because if you start pressing hard, it will get caught on all the little lovely details of the stencil, and you don't want to, for one, ruin your stencil, and you don't want to rip your sponge. So I would always say just work gradually and slowly, really lightly, say fingertip pressure, and you will get that lovely detail in the background there. So you can start seeing now how these projects are layered up. Now, also probably another thing to mention is that I'm actually holding this stencil in place. If you wanted to, you could get yourself a piece of tape, tape your project down, tape your stencil down, and then you won't be so dependent on holding this in place. But I would say if you're creating backgrounds and your stencil slips a little bit, I wouldn't worry too much, because the chances are that with whatever embellishment you'll be using for the rest of, to complete your project, whether it be a scrapbook page or a card or just a piece of art, you will probably end up covering it up. So let's say I'm just using that darker colour, and we've created a really lovely background in really lovely colours there. So you can see, just using the same technique, slightly different stencils, already we've got two really different backgrounds, but basically the same technique. Okay, so that's one way to use stencils, and hopefully you can start to see how the these background pieces are made up. I'll just give you another idea And I think as I'm going along, I think I may continue this next week also, because there are a few other demos that I want to get in, but say I don't want to overload, and I don't want to keep you sort of too long for today either. But I think I've given you enough to think about. Now, this time I'm actually using the same colour to actually stencil with, but different shades. And this can give you such a lovely sort of ombre effect as well. And also think about stenciling onto different cardstocks. I'm going onto a light blue cardstock here, which has got a lovely texture in the background. And I'm using one of Lisa's DL stencils here. This lovely floral sort of mandala type design. I mean, as it is, it looks nice with just the panel down the side. I shall be using this on the other side to show you how we can sort of fill up a square sheet using a stencil of this shape. But that in itself, I think, would look really lovely if you had some flowers or your focal point of your card, or even just words that you can just mount onto your card like so. I think that gives a really lovely effect as it is, and it's just so simple, and you can create this in so many different types of colour, in so many different colourways. Okay, so let me show you how we got on with this. Again, I shall use my blending sponge because I think that's really useful for you to see. I'm using distressed oxides this time, and I do separate my blending sponges out for regular inks and distress oxides, purely because of the nature of the type of ink that they are. For me, that works really well. So we use 3 different colours here. I'll take off my lids. So I load up my sponge, and you can see here, just by blotting off that ink, how much of that ink comes off straight away. If that was to go straight onto the project, that would have been overwhelmed your design, and you would have perhaps struggled to blend all that ink out. But as it is, see, I've taken the majority of that off now, and I can go straight onto my design, say fingertip pressure again, and just work some of that ink through the stencil. Now I can clean off that excess colour onto my copy paper, onto the side here, and all you do is just wipe that onto the paper. That's how you go about cleaning that. It's good to have your blending sponges in colour families, I suppose. So if you have a blue one and a red one, a pink one, it does sort of make it easier. You don't need to keep changing sponges, as it were. Now I'm just going to come in with another colour now, so we can start getting the ombre effect. So I'm using a darker colour, take off the excess, and just work in patches over the design. I don't want to go over the whole design, obviously, because I don't want to cover up all of the first colour that I put on. So just go randomly. At this stage, it may look a bit odd through this stencil, but don't worry too much about that, because believe me, when you take that stencil away, which is that reveal moment, which however many times or however long you've been stenciling for, having that reveal moment when you take that stencil away is always exciting. You think it never gets old. So I'm coming in with the darkest colour last, and I'll have less of this colour. So I should probably go into the centre of that mandala there. I'll use a little bit down here, a little bit there. So I'll go sparingly with this. And as I take that away, you can see that lovely effect that we have sitting on the card there. It looks completely different to how I've worked it on this sample there, but that's fine. So that's the beauty of stenciling. It gives you something different each time. So you really, I think stencils are the workhorse of your craft stash. They do so much for you, but it's so different each time you use it, and believe me, you will hardly ever create the same design twice, even if you use the stencils time and time again. Okay, so I just want to give another little idea here. You'll see now, because of I've used the Distress Oxides, which give an awful lot of residue and leave a lot of residue on our stencil. You can possibly see it there. So instead of wasting all that ink, you would have seen that I would have wiped my ink down off of there. In theory, I could have mopped all of that up, but I was going to do it with the stencil instead. So I have myself a piece of white card, and I'm just going to spritz the stencil. Now, instead of coming in with my my cleaning cloth now to wipe that away, I'm going to put my piece of card over the top of that and just mop up that ink. And that gives us a really lovely impression. Don't worry about it not being perfect, because what you're doing again is just building up layers, and it's so straightforward coming off of a stencil. And I'll bring in the sample. This was the basis of how this piece started. I mopped up the ink off this very stencil actually. You can probably just see that in the background. Now we can just make sure that that's dried off, because we need to work a little bit more ink over the top of that. And we can start adding some more detail. Now with this piece, I've used this stencil in the background just to add some more different layers. But what I thought I'd do this time, I'll bring in another different stencil. Now this one is quite a, where's my piece of black card gone? I can't find it. There it is. Now this stencil is quite a geometric shape, but you don't need to use the whole stencil. You don't need to sort of come round to these harsh edges. So I'm going to put my stencil on at an angle. I'm coming with my blending sponge. I'm not going to re-ink, I'm just going to use whatever ink is just there. Because I've already worked it off on various other projects, I know that it's not swamped with ink, so I can just come straight on and just really gently, again fingertip pressure on your blender, I can just work that ink through that design across the corner of this piece of card, and you can see now that we are building up this background pattern. Now I might do the same just across here. This is a really good sort of practice for those who like things really ordered, because it forces you to be random. Now that's something that took me a good while to sort of let go of. I did like things really ordered and lined up and square, but just to sort of train yourself out of that a little bit, if you like the random look, then using stencils is a really lovely way to do that. Okay, now this is where we can start playing, and we can start bringing in different types of stencil. We have this stencil which is like a impression of bubble wrap, and it's got some really lovely sort of fine random details in there. Now onto this piece, I'm going to finish up with the blue. I'll introduce some more colour, and I think I'm going to bring in some pink, so I can come in with my original pink that I used in my very first project. So this is one of the newest inks actually, the Kitsch Flamingo. I'll come in with my blending sponge that I was using, and I'm just going to add some detail this bubble wrap detail into the background here. Now we all know that blue and pink work really well together, and you can just see how I'm adding accents into the background like that. So this is really subtle. Now you'll notice actually the colours that I use are really subtle. I don't work very well with really bold colours. Other people in the design team do. Heidi and Natasha are fabulous at bold colours. Dawn has a really lovely good mix of using bold and subtle colours as well. I always tend to sort of err on the more pastel-y side when I'm working in the background, and I build up my colours gradually. Now you could just notice now I've picked up my blue blending sponge again, and I'm just taking away some of that whiteness in the background. I didn't put any more ink on there, and you can see that there's plenty of ink on there already. I'm keeping my blending sponge at an angle, and I'm working from my messy mat onto the project, and you can see that I'm just giving a lovely framework detail, which has still got a lovely airbrushed edge, so there's nothing harsh going on there. We don't have that unblendable blob in the background. Now, because I know that there is very little ink left on this, that means that I can actually put this blending sponge flat onto the page now and work my way all across the background. And what you'll see, that just takes away that white hint and just gives a really, really subtle blue blend into the background. Now this project now, this only tiny little project here, is great to use up all your scraps, your offcuts. It's a great size to die cut a word from, so this has so many uses. Either that, or you can just use it as a border to mount directly onto a wider project that you're using. Now what I did want to show you just quickly, and it will probably be the last thing for today to be honest, I just want to show you how you can add excuse me, getting the stencil out of the packet there. I just want to show you how you can actually use heat embossing through your stencils also. So here I've got a lovely little diamond detail going down in the background. This time I shall use like little dots here. This is off the circle aperture stencils that we have, and I think next week I will show you how to sort of maximise the use out of these. But today I'm just using this tiny little detail here just to add a little bit of shine onto this background. Now you can obviously come in with a really dark colour and just create some little spots there, or I've got another blending sponge actually here that's just a different type of sponge, and I'm going to use my clear embossing ink, and the same way as it would be just a coloured ink, I shall load up my sponge. You can do it with these sponges also, it's just that I don't have a clear one at this stage. So I'm just load up my sponge with the ink, and I'm the same way as I have done with all of my coloured inks just now, I'm just going to work that embossing ink into the stencil design. Now you'll possibly this time around want to add a little bit more to make sure that you've actually covered all the areas in the design. Obviously because it's a clear ink you won't be able to see the design that you've stenciled to replace the design if it's not quite right. So I would say be generous this time round and put plenty on. So we can take that away. Obviously at this stage we can't see anything, but I bring my copy paper in so I can load that design, load that design with embossing powder. Now I'm using Lisa's Superfine Sparkle, it's the Silver Sparkle embossing powder. And you can see straight away those dots there that I stenciled in have been highlighted with the embossing powder. Oh, there's Hazel in the background. So now this gives you the option to heat emboss this, and we have a lovely sort of a raised element and the shiny detail onto your stencil background. And I think embossing ink, actually, people do forget that if you can treat it as a normal coloured ink, you can get so many different effects from this also. Another thing that I actually quite like to do quite a while ago is actually take your embossing ink and just blend it slightly onto the side of your project like so, the same way as I did with the blue ink, and just come into the side like that. Now hopefully there's enough ink on there. So when I dip this into the embossing powder, you can actually create yourself a really lovely like a border and a frame around the outside with like it would look like a really nice distressed look with embossing powder. Now I know that isn't strictly stenciling, but I think it sort of ties into the blending techniques and the ink blending techniques. So I shall just emboss that quickly. Hopefully you can see that changing. But this gives a really lovely distressed look actually on the edge. Just something a little bit different. And sometimes I just like to do that instead of matting and layering. That's probably sometimes just enough sort of edge detail. So you can see there that there's an awful lot of technique just gone into this one little piece, and it's just a case of playing and seeing what happens. Again, I used exactly the same techniques on both of these pieces and they both look totally different, but ready to go onto a project. And I think when you start using stencils, don't think about creating an entire project to start with. Use it as a chance to sit down and play. See what your inks do, see what the patterns do. Some patterns will work, some patterns won't. It really depends on how fussy you are, and it really allows you to get to grips with the type of crafter you are as well, I think, because you start seeing a pattern, like a loose pattern developing. Say I like to use a lot softer colours, but other people, I look at other people's projects who've used bolder colours and they're just fabulous. Right, so I think I'll leave it there today. There are another couple of projects that I would like to go through with you, but I shall do that next week for sure. Hopefully that's been of interest to you today, and I've given you some ideas and some tips and tricks to give you the confidence to give stenciling a go, and also sort of helped out with some of your blending techniques. I really hope I have, because it's such a joy to, this is what I really love. This is what crafting means to me. So thanks so much for staying with me this afternoon. Let's say I could have gone on all afternoon, but I won't. I'll let you get back to what you're doing today and the sort of the lovely day outside if you have sun. I will get this video edited and put up on YouTube, so it's always there for you to go back onto and sort of replay at your own leisure. So thanks so much for staying with me this afternoon, and I shall see you next week. Take care everyone.